Anna Reid's Borderland, A Journey Through the History of Ukraine is a fairly comprehensive cover of Ukraine's history. Reid is an English journalist and an author whose work focuses primarily on the history of Eastern Europe. In this book, Borderlands, Reid reviews multiple individuals living in Ukraine and uses their responses as introductions to various themes in Ukrainian history. For example, while she's visiting a Holocaust memorial in Ivan-Frankivsk, she knows the anti-Semitic graffiti, and then uses this as a transition to talk about Ukraine's role in the Holocaust. Just one example, taking real-life interactions and then using it as a segue into history. While many historical texts tend to present Ukraine as a single unified state, Anna Reid does a good job representing the various different perspectives that existed within the state. For instance, when she interviews Crimean Tatars in the 2000s, she's quick to record that they don't really consider themselves Ukrainian, but have always felt a need for stability, which is why they favored Ukrainian statehood as opposed to the Russian annexation. This attention to perspective is consistent throughout Reid's work. She starts with the history of Kievan Rus, leading to the time of the Cossacks, and she continues all the way up to the current war in the most recent edition of this book. Throughout this history, she notes how different figures are seen differently by different groups, and she does not shy away from presenting information that may seem to contradict popular Ukrainian narratives. For instance, she describes how Russians see Khmelnytsky as a loyal subject to the Tsar, and she also describes how Poles and Jews saw him as a violent murderer. Both perspectives are different from the Ukrainian perspective that identify Khmelnytsky and the Kazakh Sikh as early signs of Ukraine's legacy. Where I feel the book is strongest is in relating Ukraine's history and Ukrainians' understanding of their history with their modern-day attitudes. The book answers questions such as what remnants of anti-Semitism remain in Ukraine, and to what degree do Eastern Ukrainians view themselves as Russian. Anti-Semitism from World War II, to be precise, or maybe some from the pogroms of the early 20th century. Much of the text was written prior to both the 2022 and 2014 invasions, so it may appear dated at times, but as a time capsule it provides useful notes. Perhaps a disadvantage of the book is that portions of it were written at various different times, so the verb tenses and narrative are often inconsistent. While it has a great section on the 2004 Orange Revolution and documents the intimidation and terrorism Putin used on Yushchenko's campaign, that is the destruction of campaign offices and intimidating crowds controlled by the Kremlin, and using intimidation crowds. That's the name of the type of crowd. They would use these crowds called intimidation crowds that were controlled by the Kremlin that would antagonize pro-Western parties. This book is perhaps not the best at describing the 2022 invasion. So it has its advantage with some of the 2004 and the 90s and the 2000s history, but it might not be the best of the 2022 invasion. Don't get me wrong, the section on the 2022 invasion is decent enough. It communicates all the current challenges going on in the war and even predicted the dilemma presented by the first 6 months of Trump's second presidency. This was written before Trump, and it predicted that Trump could be president and that support for Ukraine would waver, and we've certainly seen this. But this book really thrives as a thorough history of Ukraine as a single country as opposed to being a briefing on the current war. This is primarily a history book designed to tell and explain what Ukraine is. Where I think the book falls short is in one particular section where it describes the role of UPA and UN activists in the Holocaust. So that's the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists who played a role in fighting for Ukraine's independence during World War II. Reid concludes that the UN were just as ruthless as the Nazi invaders and resorted to routine massacres whenever it suited their genocidal needs. This is what she says. Bandera, she states, ordered the annihilation of all Jews when released from German prison in 1939. While I'm not here arguing that Reid's conclusions about UN or UPA are incorrect, I do think her book would have benefited from more demonstration on this particular point. Whether one likes it or not, UN and UPA monuments and commemorations are very popular and common in Halychnia or Galicia or Western Ukraine. Galicia is how you say Halychnia, which is a region of Western Ukraine. So I said the same thing multiple times. While Jews do enjoy equal rights in Ukraine, the commemoration of the Ukrainian insurgent army uh, has only increased since the full-scale invasion. She has a later chapter that mentions this development, which alleviates a big portion of my concerns. But when she says that Stepan Bandera ordered the genocide of the Jews, Ukrainians such as Ukraine's ambassador to Germany, Andriy Melnik, are likely to challenge her on this point. Melnik, when interviewed on the German podcast Hung and Naive, Melnik seemed either unaware of this accusation against Bandera or believed it had no factual evidence to support it. Rather, what he argued was that the UPA soldiers may have committed such atrocities, but that Bandera himself played no role in these massacres. When the interviewer mentioned a letter signed by Bandera ordering the destruction of Jews, Melnik suggested that such a letter could have been a forgery. So, people do challenge claims that the Ukrainian nationalists were involved, or they don't challenge the claim that Ukrainian nationalists were involved in the Holocaust, but they will challenge individual claims such as Bandera being involved, since he was in prison for most of the war. But that's another point of confusion, is that Reid mentions that Bandera was freed from prison in 1939, but according to Melnik and also according to Oliver Stone's documentary, Ukraine Under Fire, Bandera was imprisoned for the entirety of the Second World War. If there's a contradiction, who's right in this narrative, I do not know. Like, was Bandera in prison for the entirety of World War II, or was he released in 1939, like Reid mentions, giving instructions to slaughter all the Jews? From what I recall, I think he was imprisoned by the Austrians. He was imprisoned by the Poles in the interwar period, and then he was released briefly by the Germans, but then imprisoned by the Germans later, so he didn't really play a big role in the Second World War. But there were decrees ordered on his behalf about slaughtering the Jews, and I think when he was released from prison at the end of World War II, he told them not to kill all the Jews on the pretense that all the Jews had already been killed, and that they were no longer the target since they had been eliminated. That was one thing I remember reading at some point. So I think Reid is probably right in her assessment of Bandera, but some historians might be out there able to prove me wrong, and by all means I hope they do, because it's an unfortunate difference in interpretations of very real things that impacted people's lives. Similarly, the fights between Poles and Ukrainians concerning the role of UPA and UN fighters in Volynska provinces of what was then Poland, now Ukraine, also demonstrate that there's a real need for details when discussing this particular situation as well. Again, I reiterate that I don't necessarily think Reid is incorrect in accusing Ukrainian UN fighters of genocide. Timothy Snyder, in his book, The Reconstruction of Nations, makes the same claim. But when Reid lists specific events like those in Volynska or specific people like Bandera, it's helpful to be thorough in your demonstration and anticipate a bit of a backlash. Many Ukrainians are likely to not only see these figures differently, but to actually have conflicting historical claims. I don't think any of this should impact our view of Ukraine today's fight for its independence. This is a historical context. To use this kind of argument that UN fighters or UPA fighters were Nazis is kind of like assuming that they use some of the imagery, like they say Slava Ukraina, this came from Ukrainian nationalists, to use this kind of imagery to justify labeling Ukraine a Nazi state, even with Zelensky as president, a Jewish president. It's kind of like using Confederate flags in the South to argue that America is pro-slavery. There are different interpretations of Ukraine's history, just like there are different interpretations of America's history. What's most important is what we're advocating currently. People with Confederate flags today are not advocating for slavery. They're not explicitly advocating for this. They might be advocating for this in the past, or they might have a different view of history, but that's different from arguing that we should introduce this today. In the same sense, Ukrainians who use this imagery from the Ukrainian insurgent army, they are not arguing that we should have another Holocaust destruction of Jews. That's not what it's about. They simply have a different interpretation of their history than those who were less fortunate at their expense. So, uh, and Ukrainians had a lot of misfortunes too, which is part of how they justify this, because they had 4 to 5 million people die in Holodomor, where they were starved to death by Soviets. But this is a kind of historical bickering that goes on back and forth, and it's just very helpful to have a more demonstrative case than what Reid gives us. Um, this is perhaps unreasonable, since Reid is attempting to address the entirety of Ukrainian history, not only that of the Un and Upa. And she does give some details. She gives more than Suri Plaki's Gates of Europe, more so than a lot of other historians, in fact. However, given how often this subject is brought up, it may serve as a good basis for an entirely separate history book. From what I've seen online and Ukrainian bookstores, there are many books about Upa written in Ukrainian, but relatively few in English. But overall, Reid's perspective as a journalist overall, this is a good book, and I would say Reid's perspective as a journalist adds a personal perspective to her book, Borderlands. Where other historians theorize about the implication of past historical events on present-day attitudes, Reid takes the time to show us the attitudes using real examples, talking to real people. Whether this be indifference felt towards the Ukrainian language by Ukrainians in the East in early 2000s, or the grudge against Russians in Western Ukraine, we see a clear picture. Everything from Holodomor, Chernobyl, Baba Yar, Prince Volodymyr to present-day Zelensky is in this book. Given that range, it is a very effective history. I would not say it's my favorite history of Ukraine. My favorite is perhaps Andrew Wilson's book, The Ukrainians. But Reid's book is definitely one of the better Ukrainian histories I've read. Thank you for listening. If you feel that I misrepresented Reid's text or left something out, please feel free to comment below. I'm doing this channel to learn, after all. If you like this video and would like to see more, feel free to leave a thumbs up and subscribe. Thank you.